Well, before I get to the microphone, is there anyone who can't hear me exactly? And it's my son's audio system, so I will use it. But I just want everyone to know that right here is a significant part of film history. Led by George, this wily band of people who decided that they were going to make a real movie. The very first day of filming on Night of the Living Dead was in this exact spot. Well, how do you know, Russ, that it was the exact spot? Because when Barbara and Johnny drive up in the car, we knew from a storytelling point of view that Barbara was eventually going to release the handbrake, so we had to park the car on a grade. Where you're standing right now is exactly where the car was parked. So in a certain sense, this Evans City Cemetery, the town of Evans City, George Romero and the rest of his wily band of filmmakers, this right here is where it all started. So thank you, George. Thank you, Evans City. Thank you, Evans City Cemetery, for helping to get our movie balloon off the ground. Can people hear me, or should I go to the podium? Everyone can hear okay?
Go to the
All right. What's that? I decided that I wasn't going to use the remarks today that I used in Toronto, but I think I will, because it's the kind of story that will give you a little better impression of George Romero and the, let's say, the experimental way that he approached problem solving related to the movie business. Our very, very first job, our very first commercial job, was for Buell Planetarium, which is a science organization here in Pittsburgh, still is. We got a job to make it look as though a rocket ship was landing on the moon. Okay, well, how do we do that? The planetarium had constructed a rather large moonscape, and it was up to us as to how we made it look like a rocket ship was landing on that moonscape. Our very good friend and close colleague in the early days was Mark Ritchie, Rudy Ritchie's brother, Richard Ritchie's cousin. Mark was a certifiable genius. He really was. He had a genius of mathematics. He was also an amateur rocketeer. Mark knew how to make solid rocket fuel in small batches. So, who do you call? You call your friends. Mark, we need to whip up some fuel to make it look as though these little model rockets are actually, this model rocket is landing on the moon. Mark said, sure, I can tell you how to do that. And Mark was quite skillful at whipping up batches of this mixture to convert it into rocket fuel. And by the way, it's very close to what they actually use. So Mark instructed us, and we were experimenting. I think it was on a Sunday morning. We should mix up, George, we should mix up a batch of rocket fuel, but you know, it's Sunday morning, Mark's probably not around. He instructed us pretty well. I think we can do it ourselves. And George agreed. Why are you laughing? What could possibly go wrong? At any rate, at our very first storefront, Latent Image, we had a hot plate and a porcelain pot that we used for, you know, heating soup and that kind of thing. So we poured the ingredients for our rocket fuel into this, And one thing that Mark never let us forget, as you heat this concoction, don't let it get too brown. Well, too brown is sort of a relative term, but we thought we had it. So, in go the ingredients. It was George's job to stir the pot. It was my job to hold the pot because it was just a little hot plate. So, I'm holding the handle. George is stirring, and it's looking good. The viscosity is looking good. Everything is looking pretty good. And I said, George, you remember what Mark said about don't let it get too brown. George, it's looking like it's getting pretty brown. George, this stuff is getting really, really brown. I put the pot down and took off, and George was immediately behind me. This was in the back room of our place of business. This stuff blew up. It got too brown. We ran out onto East Carson Street, followed by this acrid, billowing smoke coming out of our storefront, Latent Image. The fire department came. We had quite a ways. It was one of the first ways, actually, that George left his mark on the world of filmmaking. The fire department and the police were not very pleased with us, but they were convinced that we weren't terrorists or anything like that. Our rocket fuel just simply blew up on us. It got too brown. But the reason for that story is that kind of experimentation, that kind of vision about how do you really make it look real, how do you make it feel real, was something that never left George in his storytelling. And as Gary said, George Romero has touched hundreds of thousands of people with his work, with his creativity, with his sensitivity. And the world is truly of a lesser place because of him. And any of us who knew him and had an opportunity to work with him and got a little bit of the glimpse inside the real George Romero, I think that anybody who met him as a fan, he was always courteous and kind, and he would stick to the bitter end to make sure that anybody who showed up to get his autograph went away happy. And not just getting an autograph, he actually engaged them. And that speaks volumes as to George's his sensitivity and his positivity. We miss him very, very dearly.